Hey everyone, real quick before the video starts, wanted to thank you all for your patience. I was out sick for a little bit, but now I'm back in full force and ready to make y'all more of that good stuff. Also, I noticed I have 3,000 subs, not bad for the new guy. So again, thank you all for sharing that energy with me. It's very much appreciated and it gives me plenty of motivation to continue to do this YouTube thing. But with that being said, let's get on with the video. Today's topic is one I've wanted to have a discussion about for a while now. This is a discussion about Star Wars. To be more precise, I'll be talking about the Star Wars sequels and prequels. Now, both sets of movies have been labeled as canonically bad, though they're not equally as bad. One is clearly way worse than the other. So before we get started here, I think it's important that we have a little talk about subjectivity and objectivity. Subjectivity being a matter of personal opinion, while objectivity being a matter of fact. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because when you are telling an original story that isn't based off of anything else, it's a brand new IP, then that's something that would fall more in line with subjectivity because only you know what entertains you. So for example, the original trilogy of Star Wars would fall more in line with being subjectively good or subjectively bad, depending on what you're looking for in a sci-fi space adventure. Like, I've heard plenty of people say that Star Wars is the best thing since sliced Wonder Bread, but on the opposite side of that, some people just don't care for Star Wars. In fact, I've heard people say that they like Star Trek way better, even though I'm sure those people are legally blind. But anyway, the original trilogy of Star Wars, that being A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, can be seen as subjectively good films, depending on your point of view. But when you expand on a story, however, be it a prequel or a sequel, then you can fall more in line with objectivity, simply depending on how you choose to expand on things with a certain IP. So for example, if you're telling me a story in which the characters in that story have some sort of special ability they can use, whether it be elemental bending, magic, martial arts, whatever, and you make it specifically known that the characters in that story have to get trained in order to get from point A to point B with their special abilities, then that rule of this character needs to be trained in order to get from point A to point B needs to stay consistent unless you have an organic workaround for why the rules are being bent or broken. Just because they're part of a bloodline that's proficient in a certain skill does not mean that they too will also be proficient in that skill. Nor does it mean that they should be able to do it just because they really believe that they can. Now, if they pick up on things faster than average, then that is what you call a prodigy. But it would still take them a while before they get really good with whatever ability they have. But if they are just good with it with no real training or an extreme lack of training, then that is objectively bad, considering the context that we had that people do need to be trained to master a certain ability. Having said all that, we can look more into the objective side of things when it comes to talking about the Star Wars sequels and prequels. Not saying that there isn't any subjectivity to be had when it comes to talking about these movies, but if it does go against the grain of what came before, and there's no real organic reason for it, then yes, that is objectively bad. Now, I don't mean to go too deep with subjectivity and objectivity, at least not in this video, but I do feel like it is important to talk about when you're talking about a sequel or a prequel, and in this case, we're talking about both. So let's start off with talking about the prequels first, because while I do agree that the prequels do get way more hate than they deserve, at the same time, the films compared to what we got before story-wise are not that good. You can still like them, but they are heavily flawed films. And the main reason for that is George Lucas. Now, I said this before plenty of times with my friends, and I'll say it here for you guys. George Lucas gets way too much credit when it comes to Star Wars. And what I mean by that is, while yes, the man did have the initial idea for the Star Wars franchise, a lot of people from Lucas's ex-wife to Gary Kurtz had to come in and help him with the original trilogy. On top of that, George Lucas is a businessman first. And it's even stated that one time he said that a movie like Empire Strikes Back would have still made as much money as it did had they not had wasted as much time making the movie as good as it was. We also know in one of the original drafts for Return of the Jedi, it was going to be called Revenge of the Jedi and have a darker ending as opposed to the one that we originally got. As well as people from producers to even Harrison Ford himself opting for the Han Solo character to be killed off in the same film. And Lucas said no on both counts, not because it was best for the story that they were trying to tell, but because it was the best thing for sales. Now, me personally, I like the ending that we got with the original trilogy. Sure, some things could have been better in Jedi, but for the most part it did keep in line with the core story of Star Wars. And while Lucas did did have more help and input when it came to the original trilogy. When it came to the prequels, he had a lot more free reign to do whatever he wanted. And from there you can see a fundamental difference between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. With the original trilogy, the main thing was we got a small group of heroes fighting back against an evil regime and trying to usher in an era of peace. And that is the basis of the plot of the first 3 Star Wars films. Come to prequels, however, the underlying basis of those 3 films is that the Jedi are so caught up in the Clone Wars as well as other things that they can't see that the real enemy is right in front of them, plotting behind the scenes and building up to the regime that we see in A New Hope. The key difference, however, is that while we've been dealing with this conflict for the entirety of the trilogy and the originals, the prequels seem to have a different conflict for each movie. Like the first movie, we were dealing with the Trade Federation invading Naboo. The second one dealt with the fallen Jedi Count Dooku, as well as the start of the Clone Wars. And the last one dealt with the end of the Clone Wars, Anakin's fall to the dark side, and the death of democracy. Also, you know,
Execute Order 66.
And the underlying thing connecting all of these conflicts together is the politics. And I can understand George Lucas wanting to get a little more political when it comes to Star Wars, just to better explain how things got from point A to point B. The problem is that George Lucas does not do a good enough job in getting us invested into the political side of things when it comes to these films. And I feel like if Lucas had had help like he had before, he probably would have been able to make all these things come together in a more cohesive way. But instead, we got the films that we got. But even still, at least these ideas are original and they're just executed poorly, whereas the sequel trilogy puts you right back in the same position you were in during the original trilogy. Like, it literally has the same premise of a small group of heroes taking on an evil regime in hopes to bring a better tomorrow. Exact same premise, just done a lot worse. For starters, you guys make Luke, Han, and Leia's struggle just completely pointless, because we're literally back at square one. Also, constructually speaking, it was like they were trying to rewrite history in saying that these guys are the real heroes of the story, not these guys. We're not even going up against a new villain. It's the same old ass man we've been fighting for like, what, 100 years now? It feels like it, at least.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I love the young people.
However, I will say, in terms of the sequels, they did not have George Lucas there at all. So this blunder is completely on Disney and Lucasfilm under the leadership of Kathleen Kennedy. It should also be noted that, reportedly, George Lucas did give Lucasfilm an outline to work with when it came to the sequels, and they just threw that out the window. And again, Lucas is not this genius that some people try to make him out to be, but he does have good ideas, and if they had just used some of these ideas, I feel like the sequel trilogy would be looked upon more favorably. But instead, they opted to do their own thing, and so we got the films that we got. But hey, maybe it isn't all bad. Maybe there's stuff in the sequels did that we all liked. Maybe we'll find that silver lining as we go into the first movie of the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens. So let's look into it, shall we? So the movie starts off letting you know that this new First Order that has risen from the ashes from the old Empire is wreaking havoc across the galaxy. Also, Luke Skywalker, the guy you probably want to see the most out of anybody in this movie, yeah, he's just conveniently gone for the moment. But we'll get into that later. Right now I just want to focus on the First Order part. So according to this, it says that the First Order is basically a byproduct of the remains of the old Empire. So why are these guys so high in numbers then? I mean, I get that this takes place 30 years after the OT, but still, if these guys are more or less the remnants of an old empire, then they should not have the military might that we see in these films. Like back in the days of the Empire, while some people did benefit from it, it was hell for the majority of the galaxy under the reign of the Empire, and now here we are in this living hell once again. And if you're gonna put us back in the same position that we were originally, then you have to explain why that is. Now, the original trilogy didn't have to do that because this is our introduction to this world, so they don't have to go into super high detail when it comes to how the Empire came to be. All we really need to understand is that these people in the galaxy are living in a shit situation and they're trying to get out of it. Episode 7 does the same thing, but now we need the context. Because from where we're sitting, Episode 7 effectively makes Episodes 4, 5, and 6 virtually pointless. And as far as the prequel trilogy is concerned, while they could have explained things better as far as the politics go, I feel like we can give them more leeway considering the fact that this is what came before, and it's not the same thing that we've seen before recycled. We see how democracy works, we see how the Jedi were back in the day, and other things of that nature. And again, while things could have been better expanded upon, you do understand that this is a whole new setting. Whereas with The Force Awakens, it tries too hard to familiarize you with the original Star Wars. And as a result, this film as well as the other two suffer for it. And that's not the only reason why these films are looked down upon, but it does play a factor. So let's look at both of these films in terms of characters, both of Episode 1 and Episode 7. So in Episode 1, the main characters are Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, Anakin, Padme, Palpatine, Maul, and fucking Jar Jar Binks. Now most of the characters in this movie aren't too particularly interesting, save for maybe Qui-Gon Jinn and Anakin to an extent. Because with Qui-Gon, he definitely seems like he sees things from a broader perspective, like he knows what needs to happen as opposed to what's actually happening. It could just be me, but he seemed like a cut above the rest. Whereas with Anakin, I like the fact that he started off as a slave, because that'll help play into what he ultimately becomes later. So I thought that was a nice little bit of information to have. And yeah, that's all I can really say about the characters, at least in terms of a good light, because everyone else seems rather one-dimensional. Even Ian McGregor didn't sell me on the fact that he was Obi-Wan Kenobi until the second film. Padme deals with the more political side of things. Maul is basically there to be an antagonist and look cool. The rest of the Jedi do fuck all in this film. Palpatine just kinda sneaks behind the scenes and does Palpatine shit. And fucking Jar Jar Binks. What can I say about this guy that hasn't already been said? I hate him, as do most of you probably. However, I will say this, I can understand what Lucas was going for with the inclusion of Jar Jar Binks in this film. He wanted him not only to appeal to kids, but also serve as comedy relief. Now this is just me personally, but as a child, I did not care too much for Jar Jar Binks. But that's just me. And I can understand wanting to put some comedy in this film, just to lighten things up a bit, but Jar Jar's humor comes off as really fucking dumb. Like stepping in shit or accidentally electrocuting himself. And the only real contributing factor that Jar Jar plays in The Phantom Menace is when he's talking to Padme about how the Gungans feel like the people of Naboo look down on them, which causes Padme to change her approach on how to get the Gungans on her side. Keep in mind, Jar Jar is just talking casually, and Padme just so happens to get an idea from him. And to make matters worse, because Jar Jar gave Padme an accidental idea to humble herself before the Gungans, Boss Nass, the leader of the Gungans at the time, decides to make Jar Jar a general of the Gungan army, who's gonna fight against the droid army invasion. Now to be fair, maybe at the time, George Lucas was trying to convey that all Gungans are just kind of idiots, but even still, the only thing that I can think of as to why Boss Nass would think that this is a good idea is that he wanted Jar Jar to die during the battle of the droid invasion. Sorry, didn't mean to go off on a side tangent, but fuck Jar Jar Binks. So let's look at the sequel trilogy characters and see how they stack up. So in The Force Awakens, we have Leia, Han, Chewie, Kylo, Rey, Finn, Snoke, and Poe as our main characters. And one thing I will say right off the bat, yes, these characters do have more personality than the ones we have in The Phantom Menace. However, while the Phantom Menace characters were kind of one note, the characters from The Force Awakens are pretty weak in their own right. I mean, Poe started out alright and then in future installments ruined his character. And Snoke, but simply because we didn't really know much about him at the time. Everyone else, however, oh boy, it's open season. Honestly, I don't know where to start, so let's start with Han first, because I believe he's the least of the worst in this film. I think we can all agree that's fair. Now, Han Solo is one of the original characters, right? He's one of the first original characters we see in The Force Awakens. So I feel like Han's character started off good, and then just kind of fell off a cliff as the film went on. So Han and Leia did get married, which was nice to know, and they had a son who they named Ben, which again, nice. Got training by Luke, again, okay, good stuff. And then their son decides, I'm gonna join the dark side. And then things just kind of fell apart from there. Now you're probably thinking, what does that have to do with Han Solo? Well, after Ben decided he was going to become Kylo Ren, Han and Leia became estranged, and apparently neither one of them tried to look for their son or talk sense into him in any way, shape, form, or fashion, which makes both Han and Leia look like bad parents. Rey knows how to fix the Millennium Falcon better than Han fucking Solo, who has had the thing for years before it was apparently stolen from him. And let's not forget how Han walked straight into a lightsaber stabbing. Granted, Leia did talk him into it, but still, come on, Han. And speaking of Leia, let me talk about her a little bit. So she sends Han out to try to bring Ben Solo back to his senses. But we know that Ben is a trained, force-sensitive person, so this is not going to end well. We also know that Leia is Force sensitive. That being said, why didn't she go out to help retrieve Ben? Now I understand that she's got a huge operation that she's overseeing, but surely to Space Christ, she has got to have some sort of second in command or somebody that can take her place should she be absent, injured, or killed. Like Kylo Ren looked like he was very close to coming back to his senses when he was talking with Han, and I feel like if both of them had been there, they might have succeeded. And even if they hadn't, at least Leia could have done some Force trickery or some shit to save Han from getting killed. Now you didn't have to give me every single thing I wanted from these characters after seeing them after so many years, but they should have been written better than this. But let's talk about the new characters for a bit, starting with Finn, or as I like to call him, Wasted Potential. So all the promotional stuff leading up to The Force Awakens made you believe that Finn was going to be someone of great importance. Primarily that he was going to be the new Jedi character. But no, Finn is basically nothing throughout the entirety of all three of these films. Like he starts off as a stormtrooper and he breaks through his programming because he saw somebody die, which I guess he's never seen somebody die before, but whatever. At first I thought that was the will of the Force or something because, again, throughout all the promotional stuff it made it seem like he was going to be the new Jedi. But over the course of the film I was looking at him be goofy as fuck. Now I'm thinking to myself, how in the hell is this guy gonna become a Jedi? So as I'm watching the film, I'm thinking, okay, maybe he's gonna break out of this goofy personality that he's got later on as the film progresses. And at first it seems like they're going that route. But no, he just becomes more insufferable as the film goes on. And then we find out that he's not even the fucking Jedi. It's motherfucking goddamn Rey. Which I'll get on her in just a moment. But Finn is basically the stereotypical funny black dude. As a black man myself, I didn't personally care for that because, again, they made it seem like he was going to be an important dude. But he's not. He's no one of relevance. Not in The Force Awakens, not in The Last Jedi, and not in The Rise of Skywalker. Seriously, if you take this dude out completely, not a heck of a lot changes throughout these films. You wanna know what John Boyega is in these films really? He is a diversity hire. He's there just for the sake of saying we love black people, but then when it comes to China, womp womp. But enough about him, let's talk about Rey, the bestest fucking Star Wars character ever since Jar Jar goddamn Binks. Now Rey starts off as a scavenger character. She doesn't know much about the Force or anything like that, nor should she be proficient in the ways of the Force. Though she is good with that bow staff thingy, she proves to be pretty capable in her own way with the first few minutes that we get with her, scavenging for scraps that she can trade in for food, on a desert planet that is not Tatooine, waiting for her mysterious parents to come back and get her. Ooh, I wonder who they could be. And as the film goes on, we learn that Rey is a woman of many talents. Like I said, she knows how to repair a ship better than a guy who's owned it for God knows how many years. She's a pretty good pilot, and get this, she's Force sensitive. So much so that apparently she can use things such as Jedi mind tricks and Force pull without any prior training whatsoever. But that's not all, she's also a skilled lightsaber duelist. And again, with no prior training, she takes what should have been the next greatest villain of Star Wars and turned him into a complete beta cuck. Ah yes, Rey truly is the bestest ever. And now let's talk about Kylo Ren, the new big bad, the new Vader-esque villain. If I were to sum him up, I would say that he is a wannabe Darth Vader fanboy, an angsty teen who did not receive enough love as a child and is therefore taking it out on everybody else. Seriously, that's his whole motivation for going to the dark side. That and also Luke apparently tried to kill him or something like that. Honestly, it's sad that the last cool thing this dude ever did was stop a blaster ball mid-shot. Beyond his introduction, he doesn't really have much of an impact in these films aside from being an antagonist that the heroes have to overcome. Which I probably wouldn't mind if there was at least some level of intrigue when it came to this character, but there really isn't. Now I know I spent more time talking about the sequel characters than I did the prequel characters, but that's only because, like I said, the prequel characters are just kind of boring. At least for episode 1. But moreover, we need to see how these characters evolve throughout the course of these films. And I feel like in those terms, both of the films kind of fumbled the ball a little bit, primarily due to how they choose to handle time skips. Like with The Force Awakens, they ended it on a cliffhanger, and so they felt like they had to respond to that cliffhanger, but in the process, that didn't leave them much breathing room between episode 7 and 8, and that's part of the reason for why 8 came out the way it did. Now in terms of the prequels, from episode 1 to episode 2, there's a whole 10-year time gap, so any development the characters got happened off screen. So it kind of feels like Lucas put characters in positions they should have already been in from from the start, with Obi-Wan training Anakin, the Clone Wars kicking off, etc. And when you really think about it, the only real point of relevance that The Phantom Menace has is telling us where Anakin grew up. Like, beyond Anakin's origins, so to say, The Phantom Menace really doesn't have that much of an impact when it comes to the prequel trilogy. Yes, things have been done to make it stand out more retroactively throughout comics and books and crap, but if you've seen all three of these films in the early 2000s, then you know that The Phantom Menace really didn't amount to much. Again, in terms of the trilogy. And it was only during the last film of the prequels and sequels did the people behind these films realize that, okay, maybe we need to do better with the passage of time. With episode 3 taking place only a few years after episode 2, and episode 9 having at least 1 year taking place after episode 8. So how have characters changed throughout the first movie to the last? Like in the original trilogy, we got development for quite a few characters, such as Luke, Han, and Vader. And not every single character has to be super developed from the starting point to the ending point. I mean, Leia was virtually the same character throughout all three of the films, and yet she's still one of the best Star Wars characters out there. However, character growth is important when telling any good story, and looking back on the sequels, nobody got any real development, really. I mean, Rey does go from being a powerful character to a super powerful character. Finn stays virtually the same throughout the entirety of the trilogy. Poe regresses as a character. Leia does fuck all in these films. Snoke was a joke. Who gives a fuck about Hux? Luke basically becomes the character that we've known him to be once again, after The Last Jedi took a massive shit on his character, and Kylo Ren becomes quote-unquote redeemed after having an imaginary talk with his dead dad. There was no hero's journey, nobody got any actual development, nobody went through any actual arcs. There isn't even a character like Leia who doesn't really develop but is still an interesting character. No, they're all terrible characters, old and new alike. The prequels, on the other hand, not only developed some of the characters, but they did have interesting characters like Count Dooku in there. I also thought Padme was alright, but you got to see characters like Anakin develop. Obi-Wan was becoming more and more like how we knew Obi-Wan in the original trilogy, and you could tell what Lucas was going for when it came to these characters, even though I feel like some things could have been touched upon a little better. Now, I do think it's important that we do talk about how these trilogies approach certain things and what they were going for. Now, I'm not going to cover every single detail because I don't want to take up too much of y'all's time, but I feel like bringing up one key moment in each of the trilogies should suffice. The first one I'm going to talk about is in the prequels, that being Anakin's initial turn to the dark side. This pretty much happened when he decided he was going to save Palpatine from Mace Windu and doom Windu to death. Now, I understand what George Lucas was going for here. He was trying to make it so that Anakin was so desperate to save Padme that he was willing to do literally anything, even going down the path of the dark side. And we've already seen that Anakin doesn't handle loss that well. So I understand what he was trying to do with this, but it's very sloppily done given the context that we have. For starters, Anakin knew that Palpatine was the Sith Lord they were looking for, the one that started the Clone Wars from the get-go. He's even the one to tell Mace about this. And despite knowing that he is a very dangerous enemy, he still chooses to assist Palpatine over Mace. And I know there have been plenty of people trying to justify that moment by saying things like, well, Anakin's been frustrated with the Jedi for a long time, they keep lying to him, he was desperate, watch the Clone Wars, read this book, blah blah blah. But I'm not saying that the build-up to him turning to the dark side doesn't make sense. I'm just saying the initial turn doesn't make sense. Also, Lucas wanted to make it seem like Anakin was all out of options, but from my point of view, that wasn't the case. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no death penalty for Anakin coming clean on the fact that him and Padme are a married couple. At most, they'll just lose their jobs. At least that's how I understand things. And if that's the case, why didn't Anakin fess up to the Jedi Council? And even if he didn't feel comfortable talking to all of them, he could have at least gone to Obi-Wan. Like, I definitely feel like Obi-Wan would have had their back and would have helped him out in any way he thought possible. I guess it just feels like there's a ton of different ways Anakin could have approached this, and he just didn't think to do none of it. So again, why I understand George Lucas's intentions. He did not cover all of his bases when it came to Anakin's decision to ultimately join the dark side. And like I said, there are plenty of other things I can understand what Lucas was going for too, with things like midichlorians, Jar Jar, the politics, etc, etc. But again, they weren't executed that well. Now back on the sequel side side of things, well, what can I say? There is nothing about the sequels that I can look at and be like, okay, I understood the intention behind that. No, the entirety of the sequels is just one big nonsensical mess. And nothing is more nonsensical in these sequels than their treatment of Luke Skywalker. Bet y'all thought I wasn't going to talk about this Jake Skywalker person. Oh no, his day in court starts now. One of Star Wars' most beloved characters. One of the most beloved characters in all of fiction. We finally get to see again on the big screen after decades. And one of the first things he does is takes his father's lightsaber and throws it over his shoulder for a cheap gag. We also learn that this version of Luke decided to hide away on Ahch-To not for the sake of training another Jedi like Yoda did, not for being in an advantageous position to help in the conflict with the First Order, but because he's apparently the main reason why Kylo Ren decided to join the dark side. Why, you might ask? Well, this guy right here, masquerading as Luke, was able to sense a great darkness in his nephew one day, and decided that the best way to deal with this would not to be to talk to him or help him quell his darker impulses, but rather to assassinate him in his sleep. And they want you to believe that this is the same Luke Skywalker who redeemed Darth Vader, one of the most evil dudes in the galaxy. But because his nephew was thinking these dark side thoughts, he just had to put him into the ground. Granted, he regretted it like a couple of seconds afterwards, but still, the fact that he had the initial thought is stupid. Like, does that sound like Luke to you guys? Maybe Ericus from Kingdom Hearts, but Luke fucking Skywalker? Bitch, please, who are they trying to fool? Also, instead of taking responsibility for Kylo Ren, he just lets him do whatever the fuck he wants throughout the galaxy and hides away on this little planet.
What? What the fuck?
Like, this guy is only Luke Skywalker in name only. He is not the character Luke Skywalker. Now, I can understand a character changing over time. After all, it's been like 30 years since the original trilogy in this timeline. But there are some things you need to consider. Like, for example, Luke isn't the main character in this new trilogy. He's barely even a side character in all honesty. And if that's the case, any time that we get with Luke needs to be spent making him look as amazing as possible. Also, we're introduced to Luke going through this arc in this movie, and then he gets over it and becomes the Luke Skywalker that we've all known him to be at the end of the same movie?
I still don't get it.
I mean, what can I say that hasn't already been said? That's fucking dumb. Horrendous storytelling on a massive scale. Like, the only reason they chose to make Luke Skywalker the way he was in The Last Jedi was for the sake of writing him out of the story so that the newer characters could shine. But the new characters suck, so what the fuck?
Wait a minute. This isn't my world. Disappointed!
So now let's talk about the main problem of both of these trilogies. Starting with the prequel trilogy, I feel like its main problem was that, as I said at the beginning of the video, George Lucas is a businessman first and foremost. So he'll do what it takes in pursuit of the money, but that may not be the best thing for Star Wars. Now, I'm not saying that he's not passionate about Star Wars, but it does seem like he lets the money kind of overshadow the storytelling process. And don't get me wrong, these movies still made a shit ton of money, not just at the box office, but in merchandise as well. However, they're not good films in comparison to what came before. Though again, as I've stated, I can see glimmers as to what Lucas was going for when it came to the prequels. The same cannot be said for the sequel trilogy. Some people speculated there with The Force Awakens as to what was going to happen with the story, but we never got a gauge as to where the story was headed. We never understood what was supposed to happen with these characters. Why are we back in the same position we were in years prior? What's this going to do to continue the legacy of the original characters? I mean, the last one is literally called Rise of Skywalker, but all the Skywalkers are dead. So maybe it should have been called Get a Rise Out of Skywalker, because they should all be pissed at this fuckery right here.
I'm Rey. Rey who? Rey Skywalker.
Shut the fuck up! Know your fucking place, trash!
But in all honesty, in my opinion, the biggest problem that the sequel trilogy had is that it had no plan for these films. Like with The Force Awakens, they put us in this New Hope-esque setting and put all these mystery boxes in here to pique your interest. And in the second film, The Last Jedi, they closed the door on all these mystery boxes, which is bad enough on its own. But then none of the answers that we got in Last Jedi were satisfactory answers to the mysteries that were set up in The Force Awakens. So in comes Rise of Skywalker, the last movie of a trilogy that's had its legs cut from from underneath it, and the result is a very piss-poor finale. And that's putting it lightly. At least with Lucas and the prequels, he had a plan, albeit a flawed one, though I would much rather have a flawed plan than no plan. Like, it's clear that the people behind the sequels were not passionate about the project whatsoever, and cared little to nothing about the Star Wars brand as a whole. And granted, yes, these movies also made a lot of money at the box office, but each movie made less than the last one. On top of that, merchandise didn't sell nearly as well for the sequel trilogy as it did for the prequel trilogy. Let that sink in. Jar Jar Binks sold more merchandise than fucking Mary Sue wannabe Skywalker. Okay, that last one may have been a bit of an exaggeration, but you get what I mean. And really quickly, I want to talk about some of the retroactive continuity. Now, for most of the prequel stuff regarding TV shows, comic books, regular books, video games, etc., the things that have been done to make the prequels retroactively better have been pretty well received, albeit a hiccup or two here and there. It's pretty much for the most part not bad. Whereas when the sequels tried to expand upon or better explain something through some sort of outside means, they just end up making things worse, and I didn't think that was possible. Like, there is no demand for the sequel trilogy in any capacity. It is effectively dead and in the ground. All I can really hope for at this point is that Doomcock is right, and that there is a plan to just decanonize the sequel trilogy altogether. So in conclusion, while the prequels are still to this day bad films, you can understand what Lucas was trying to do with this trilogy, giving you a glimpse of what things were like before the Empire had taken over the galaxy, as well as the rise of Darth Vader. And while I don't feel like you should have outside lore from a book or whatever to make a film that you just saw better, at the very least, they do make the films more enjoyable. And with the sequels, I can't put up a defense, like they are just objectively bad films. And again, there was no passion for the craft, for the IP, or for the fans. And Lucasfilm is learning the hard way that the fans do in fact matter. While the sequels didn't necessarily kill Star Wars, they most certainly came close to doing so. And with the future of Star Wars resting solely on the Disney Plus shows, I can only hope that the future is bright from here on out. But let me know what you guys think. Did you enjoy the prequels? Did you love the sequels? And if so, why? Seriously, feel free to write me some novels down there in the comment section, because I just can't understand for the life of me why anybody would like the Star Wars sequels. The prequels, fine, whatever, but sequels?
You serious?
Thank you guys for your continued support. As always, smash the like and hit subscribe. And don't forget to follow me on my social media platforms, or else.
It's treason.